I think of Saturn retrograde sort of like Jurassic Park. You see, systems fail, structures collapse, plans go awry, electric fences go down, velociraptors learn how to open doors. Ah! Clever girl. This is Saturn, girl. And we have a big transit happening. You see, Saturn, my personal Lord and Savior, stations retrograde on June 29th and won't go direct again until November 4th. So let's look at the fun chart, shall we? There, you see old Saturn, my Lord Saturn. See the little S right there? That means he's slowing down and stationing. Stationing, and then boom! You see, that S turned red, which means he's stationing retrograde at 19 degrees Pisces. In this video, we're going to talk about the meaning of Saturn retrograde and how this will affect you personally by doing your horoscopes for the occasion. So you better watch this whole video till the end. Otherwise, you'll upset Saturn, which is sort of like having collections come after you, except he'll ruin your credit score even more. See, I'm Saturn, girl, and being his favorite child is rough, I tell ya. He's extra hard on me. In fact, he's so hard I can feel him throbbing in my guts. I really should say she, because if you follow me, you know that I treat Saturn as a feminine planet, as did the famous 1st century ancient astrologer Dorotheus of Sidon. I mean, what do you expect from a guy whose name is the ancient Greek equivalent of Dorothy? You know how modern astrologers think of outer planets as transpersonal? Well, I think of Saturn as trans femme. She's my malevolent matriarch, my lord and lady, my queen mother. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to her as she and her. But first, what are retrogrades and what do they mean? Retrograde motion is when a planet appears to move backwards through the zodiac. If you were to watch that planet over multiple days, you would see it regressing relative to the fixed stars. We know the planets don't actually move backwards. They all orbit the sun in the same direction, but at different speeds. You see, when the faster moving Earth begins to approach within 60 degrees of a slower moving planet, that slower planet will appear to slow down even more, to stop, and then move backwards. It only appears to look this way from our vantage point because of the varying orbital speeds of the planets. The slower a planet is, the longer it will appear to move backwards. In fact, Saturn goes retrograde once a year for about 4.5 months. Now, retrogrades signify 3 main things. Number 1, reversals. Number 2, delays. And number 3, having to readdress past issues. Meanwhile, Saturn represents structures, boundaries, authorities, control, and restrictions. And old things, or old people. I mean, Saturn girls like that sort of thing. What are you up to tonight, Grandmommy? Want to come over and watch Pat Sajak with me? But I think of Saturn retrograde sort of like Jurassic Park. You see, systems fail, structures collapse, plans go awry, electric fences go down, velociraptors learn how to open doors. Ah! Clever girl. We see some interesting events during Saturn retrograde, don't we? Literally the day that Saturn stationed retrograde in 2023 was the same day that the Titan submersible, the one that was supposed to visit the wreckage of the Titanic, imploded on itself. So yeah, structures do collapse, don't they? It was a sub that crushed 5 guys. But I'm a sub that wants to get crushed by 5 guys. Going to visit the Titanic is pretty Saturnian itself. Remember that Saturn rules old things and old people. And speaking of old people, the last time that Saturn went retrograde, Pat Sajak got replaced on Wheel of Fortune by human Ken doll Ryan Seacrest. Dude looks like the picture that came with the frame, doesn't he? I bet he's packing like Ken, too. But hey, if there's no more Pat Sajak, how else am I going to warm up my geriatric girlfriends on weeknights? But you see how that's literally an age reversal, right? It's like taking an old man's job and giving it to a himbo. And speaking of Ken dolls, the Barbie movie came out last time Saturn was retrograde. I love Barbie and her movie. And talk about reversals. Not only did the movie piss off the patriarchy, but it also became Warner Brothers' highest grossing global release ever, beating out Harry Potter and the something whatever the fuck, raking in $1.34 billion. Take that, J.K. Scowling. Let's be honest though, Barbie was just Black Panther for white women. I stole that joke. But some very serious international events happened around the same time too. We saw challenges to authority, like the Screen Actors Guild strike and the United Auto Workers strike. We also saw an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden that didn't go anywhere. And Donald Trump was indicted for trying to overthrow the 2020 election and probably the United States government. But the most important event was October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel. In response, Israel released a siege, causing unparalleled carnage and horror. This is a prime example of a challenge to authority, and this conflict will undoubtedly force the world community to readdress the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people. But what's the deal with people with Saturn retrograde in their natal charts? I mean, hey, who are these people? That's a really bad Jerry Seinfeld impression. Actually, Jerry Seinfeld has Saturn retrograde in his natal chart too, but no one really cares about him anymore. Anyway, we often see people who push societal boundaries and conventional norms. We're often seen as different, or just straight up strange. We're often reviled, rejected, and restrained. We may push boundaries, but we also tend to suck at our own. I mean, we don't even know what boundaries are, do we? We have to be careful not to let people push us around. And remember, people treat us like we let them treat us. Some examples of people with natal Saturn retrograde are me. I mean, isn't it obvious? I'm delightfully obnoxious, and my dharma is destruction. We also have people like Vladimir Lenin, the famous revolutionary and father of the communist revolution in Russia. We also have Che Guevara, another revolutionary and one of the fathers of the Cuban Revolution. We also have Malcolm X, the famous black revolutionary who was a contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr. We also have political dynamos like Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin Roosevelt. She wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which effectively challenged the balance of world power. We also have Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, who also gave millions of Americans access to healthcare who didn't previously have it. Lady Gaga has this too. I mean, shouldn't that be obvious? She wore a fucking meat suit, for Christ's sakes. Yeah, I was born this way too. But what, pray tell, does this mean for you? This isn't a time for action. Rather, it's a time for reflection. You see, Saturn builds up structures and tears them down. Over the past 8 months or so, you've been working, accomplishing, and building. But how well did you build? Are your plans and structures standing up to the turbulence rattling around you? These are the questions we ask ourselves while Saturn is retrograde. If you didn't lay a good foundation, you will be forced to go back and do it again. The kinds of projects you've been occupied with will be indicated by the house Saturn is transiting in your chart. So now we're going to talk about what this looks like for you by doing your horoscopes. Remember, we do these for each rising sign because that's what determines your houses. But if you don't know your rising sign, you can watch for your sun sign. So let's start with Aries Rising. For Aries Rising, this means Saturn is in the 12th house of self-undoing, that is, mental health and isolation. This transit often puts us into exile. We feel isolated, pushed out of our comfort zone. We feel alone. We feel abandoned. Oftentimes, self-destructive habits and mental health issues come to the surface. But Saturn retrograde here forces us to look at the ways that we've thwarted our own success. The next 4 months or so are about acknowledging how you've been your own worst enemy. And then you can brainstorm strategies to avoid getting sucked back into the downward spiral. That was a great Nine Inch Nails album, wasn't it? But let's move on to Taurus Rising. So for Taurus Rising, this means Saturn is in the 11th house of hopes and friends, and the people who support us. Saturn in this house strains our relationships with friends and groups that we may belong to. It could be that someone or something in your life starts dominating your attention, and you may find yourself alienated or isolated from your friends. It could be a spouse, family member, or a particular friend who always has issues. It's like there's a conflict between our hopes and aspirations and what's more comfortable and familiar. We often feel hopeless, or like there's nothing to look forward to, just expecting bad things to happen. But Saturn retrograde is forcing us to recognize how fear has sabotaged our own aspirations and prompts us to have a vision for who we want to be and have faith in the future. If you don't have something to look forward to or to put your sense of faith in, then life feels stunted and meaningless. But let's move on to Gemini Rising, our Gemini Rising homies. So for Gemini Rising, this means Saturn is in the 10th house of life direction. When Saturn goes through this house, it feels like opportunities just slip through our fingers, that we don't get the recognition we deserve, and that our life direction gets derailed. Our career plans often fall apart, and what we think we wanted starts to be unfulfilling. You may find yourself getting that grass is always greener sort of mentality, but this time you're right. You've outgrown your old situation. But Saturn retrograde is forcing you to consider other possibilities. She's showing you that your previously chosen path was leading to a dead end. And she's helping you to reorient your life direction. And don't worry, things will get clearer next year. But let's move on to Cancer Rising, our Cancer Rising homies. So for Cancer Rising, this means Saturn is in your 9th house of beliefs and values. This also means that the past year or so has challenged your worldview. You're finding long-held beliefs, perhaps from your parents or family, no longer suit you. And it could be a painful realization. You could feel lost or drifting in the wind. You probably had to face the fact that you were wrong. It's almost like we lose God, but it's really just our worn-out ideas about God that don't sustain us anymore. While Saturn is retrograde, though, you'll find yourself hungry for meaning again, and ideas that you previously rejected will seem more attractive. You see, Saturn is admonishing you to be less rigid in your thinking and more inclusive in your understanding. But let's move on to Leo Rising, our Leo Rising Hermes. So you see here, this puts Saturn in the 8th house of death and debt. While Saturn is in this house, we often have to face losses. Sometimes it's financial, or sometimes it's someone very important in our lives. It could very literally mean death, debt, or loss of income, and life will undoubtedly get a bit more overwhelming. Sometimes we end up sharing income in our relationships, like opening a shared bank account with a spouse. Other times it's more psychological, and we find ourselves suddenly have to face trauma and bitter memories we thought we'd resolved. However, Saturn retrograde here shows us that we're not in control and that much of life just happens to us. How we respond is what matters. She's forcing us to forgive, let go, and to let things be as they are. Remember the serenity prayer? Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, and to change the things I cannot accept, and the wisdom to tell the difference. I think that's it. I'm paraphrasing, you see. But let's move on to Virgo Rising. Our Virgo Rising Hermes. So for Virgo Rising, this puts Saturn in the 7th house of marriages and partnerships. Several things tend to happen while Saturn goes through this house. We either see our commitments and relationships deteriorate, or we make new long-lasting commitments. Often we get a renewed sense of independence, and our committed relationships get strained. We start to consider hard decisions like, should I stay or should I go? Should I stay or should I go now? Right? Anyway. Other times we make even deeper commitments like getting married or engaged. Saturn retrograde here makes us reconsider the gravity and the implications of these decisions. Will this commitment be an obstacle to your chosen path? Make sure you choose wisely. But let's move on to Libra Rising. Our Libra Rising homies. For Libra Rising, this puts Saturn in the 6th house of injuries and illnesses. When Saturn goes through this house, she puts us to work. Last year, you probably started to feel uncomfortable with how unstable your life had been. Now is the time to take responsibility for your situation and to start applying steady effort. You're being forced to organize your life so that you can take care of all the things that you'd rather avoid. You could also see health challenges pop up during this time. If you have a chronic condition, expect flare-ups. It will probably interfere with your work or daily life. Saturn retrograde here, though, is teaching you that you can't cut corners. Leaving little loose ends will eventually make the whole rope unravel. She's also admonishing you to practice self-care and to address your health issues as you try and get your life in order, you see? But let's move on to Scorpio Rising. Our Scorpio Rising friends. So for Scorpio Rising, this puts Saturn in the 5th house of children and pleasure. The 5th house is usually fun, but when Saturn is here, life gets too chaotic and unstable to be any fun. It's like we're constantly putting out small fires and juggling multiple stressful situations. If you have children, they may have persistent difficulties during this time, or your relationships with them could become strained. Sometimes there's a custody battle that happens. Similar to the 8th house, though, Saturn retrograde is telling us to stop juggling, to prioritize, and to let go of our previous expectations. She gives us the chaos and instability to remind us that we aren't equipped to handle life when we can't find enjoyment in it. So please learn to have fun again. But let's move on now to Sagittarius Rising. Our Snagimattarius Rising Hermes. This puts Saturn in the 4th house of home, parents, and private life. When Saturn goes through this house, she typically does a few things, right? It can disrupt our living situation. We may have to find a new place. Or if we had been looking, we'll see delays. For example, many consider to buy a house and realize they probably can't. We also often see relationships with parents strained. This may be from a rejection of your family's traditional values or their behavior. Or perhaps they reject you and your values or your behavior. We may also be alienated from our past or heritage. Maybe you find out that your ancestors were assholes like mine. Saturn retrograde here, though, is asking us to realize that home is where we make it. Wherever you are, that's where home is. She's also teaching us that we don't have to be restrained by our past, that it doesn't define us, nor do we have to militate against it, but rather forge our own traditions. But let's move on now to Capricorn Rising, our Crapricorn Rising Hermes. This puts Saturn in the 3rd house of communication and extended family. Saturn in this house reminds me of that scene in The Matrix, right? Where Agent Smith is interrogating Neo. And Neo says, "How about I give you the finger and you give me my phone call?" And Agent Smith says, What good is a phone call, Mr. Anderson, when you are unable to speak? Right? And then his mouth starts to close and it can't open again. You see, we lose our voice during this transit. Sort of like Ariel from The Little Mermaid, right? Ah. Our minds aren't as sharp. We're less articulate, and our ideas get sloppy. This often correlates with delays in education or writing and speaking projects. Alternatively, we also see struggles with siblings and extended family. Brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins may have their own issues and reach out to us for help. Saturn retrograde here, though, shows us how to organize our thoughts and our logical reasoning by throwing a load of brain farts at us, right? Like last night's debate. She's telling us that being more careful, thoughtful, and deliberate with our words makes us more effective people. But let's move on to Aquarius Rising. My Aquariumus Rising Hermes. That's me. And this puts Saturn in our second house of personal property and income. So for the past year or so, you've likely been trying to build up a business or start a new job. And now you're worried about money, aren't you? If you've made significant investments in a business venture, you're beginning to panic, aren't you? I know I am. Expenses are starting to pile up. If you haven't been organizing your finances and balancing your income and expenses, it's catching up with you now. I know it is for me. Saturn retrograde will force us to go back and bring order to our books and reconcile our balance sheets. She's teaching us how to manage our resources and build a better enterprise, whether that's in business, work, or even at home. But let's move on now to Pisces Rising, our Pisces Rising Hermes. You see, this puts Saturn in the first house of self. I mean, this placement takes the cake, doesn't it? Saturn transiting our first house can be a little depressing, melancholy, and even physically painful. We find ourselves feeling inadequate or defeated, feeling older or aging, and we start to consider our own mortality. You see, Saturn here makes us even more aware that our death is inevitable, and that each breath we take brings us a step closer to it. If we have chronic health conditions, they often get worse during this time. But she also forces us to face parts of ourselves that we've avoided. Our appearance can also change drastically too. Saturn retrograde here, though, disrupts our psychology to help us see how we can be more authentic. You see, she disrupts our sense of self so that we can be more ourselves. Saturn retrograde is teaching us to be ourselves, yes? And also that there's always more of ourselves to be. Well, I hope that's useful. Let me know in the comments how this transit has affected you in the past. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Please also consider tipping me. You can give through Super Thanks below or use my PayPal link in the description. It helps me keep making such wonderful content. And remember, I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org, or contact me directly. All my info is below in the description. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful whatever it is you're having.